It's February 12th of 1994. Officer Carter from the Thornton Police Department is arriving for work, and sitting in front of the Thornton PD is a running car. It's gone up over the curb, and it's sitting in the grass. All he's trying to do is come to work. And he discovers that work has come to him.
He didn't know whether this was a drunk driver crash or otherwise.
He goes into police officer mode and bails out of his car to see what's happening. There is a woman behind the wheel covered in blood. She has suffered multiple gunshot wounds.
Help me! Please! He shot me! Please, please.
She was able to communicate that a passenger in her car had been abducted by a man.
There's another victim in the hands of the shooter, and he's fled off into the early morning light. She said, "This just happened. You have to find him."
I'm Rick Archer. I'm a retired Thornton Police Department detective. I would never introduce myself that way. I'd introduce myself, "Hi, I'm Rick." Anyway, I was in college at Indiana State University, and I had full intent on going to law school. Just was not the lid that fit my pot. So, like, I've got this great education. What do I do with it? I guess I'll become a police officer. I hit my stride when I was moved into detectives. I got to use more brain power, and ultimately was named as the lead homicide investigator. I was sound asleep, enjoying rest, which I rarely got. Then I just got a call from patrol sergeant. There's not a lot of times you end up with a shooting victim on the front lawn of the Thornton Police Department. So just the circumstances were really unique.
Detective Rick Archer is summoned to handle a crime scene at his own police department. Somewhat odd. We don't provide curb service, but sometimes we have to.
So I get over there and I take a look around the scene, and there it is. A gold Cadillac in the front lawn of the Thornton Police Department. Driver's side door and passenger side door open. There was blood throughout the interior.
Archer looks more closely at the car, sees bullet holes in the driver's door, and sees a bullet hole in the seat.
There was also evidence of somebody having been drugged from the passenger side into the street. And they're telling me that there's a possibly abducted woman as part of this. And your mind just races trying to figure out, okay, what resources am I going to need?
The only person that knows details is in a Denver hospital. The EMTs are not confident that this woman's going to survive.
From that point, I sent a team of 2 detectives to the hospital so that if Jackie's able to provide any statements pre-surgery, we have somebody there to get them.
Some people have a very strong will to live, and that's obviously the case with this girl. She has suffered 3 gunshot wounds, but she's with us. And she is conscious.
Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Can you state your full name for me, please?
Jackie Criato.
Jackie, can you tell me about the events which occurred yesterday?
I had left my apartment at 5:30 in the morning, was heading to my dad's house. I was going eastbound on I-76, and as I made the turn coming along, I saw emergency flashes going and all that.
And she thinks maybe they need some assistance of some kind, and she pulls over behind the car and stops.
It was a small blue Geo Metro.
And all of a sudden, a girl, not wearing a top, runs to her car, jerks the door open.
She jumped in the car. She was screaming that he had been raping her, and she needed to get the heck out of there.
And so Jackie took off.
What was her attitude like?
She was hysterical.
The girl told her her name was Rhonda Maloney. She got off work and she was driving back home when she got rear-ended by a car. It just bumped her. So she stopped to see what the damage was. And when she got out of the car, she was immediately attacked.
She said that he had raped her for 2 hours, and she said she didn't know who he was or where he'd come from. So I went through the intersection and knew I could go to the police station at 92nd.
So now they've driven only a short distance. The car the girl got out of begins to immediately chase them.
He sped up and tried to get alongside of me. At that time, he just started rapid fire.
The driver of the car continued firing on them all the way up the highway.
Jackie feels herself get hit with a bullet, multiple gunshot wounds, but she continues to drive. She's determined to reach the police.
At some point, she realized that her legs weren't working.
And that's when I lost control of my vehicle, and I tried to turn it into where I was headed.
And ended up coming to rest on the lawn of the Thornton Police Department.
That's normally when a criminal goes the other way. Not this guy. He's not done yet. This guy looks directly at her, points the gun at her face.
And he screamed at me that I should keep my mouth shut, or else he was going to kill me.
Rhonda was curled up in a ball on the passenger side. The fella pulled Rhonda out, saying something like, "You thought you were going to get away."
She was screaming that she couldn't see and that she was in all kinds of pain.
He drags this screaming woman back to his car and they drive off.
I got the impression it was his intention that she was going to die.
Good God, who are we dealing with here? Is this Jack the Ripper?
When he leaned over in the car, that was the best look I got at him.
He was described as a younger, light-skinned, moon-faced black male.
She says his face is burned into my mind. She's a very good witness.
What kind of car was he driving?
A Saturn, a late model Saturn.
The reason that was unique to us was just there weren't a lot of Saturns out. I don't think most people even knew what a Saturn was in those days. So at that point in time, the immediate thing is to find Rhonda.
Anytime a kidnapping has occurred, the urgency is absolutely extreme. The only way for a kidnapping to end and for a criminal to ensure his escape is to kill the victim.
Our focus was trying to find that Saturn. We had already requested assistance from the Air National Guard to come out with helicopters and do anything they could for us.
They do a search of the area and they find nothing.
Jackie had told us where Rhonda's car was, and we went down there.
Rhonda's vehicle was a small blue Geo, and it had some minor damage on it.
There's a fresh dent in the rear of Rhonda Maloney's car.
There was some footprints, there were some tire tracks. We had nothing else.
Archer is thinking about this case now as the pursuit hopefully begins soon on the Saturn, and he remembers something. An intelligence report he read several years before about a girl who wound up murdered in Estes Park in 1988, 70 miles northwest of the Thornton Police Department.
So at that point in time, I reached out to Larimer County and I got a copy of their case file. It had never been solved. And reading through the case file, it was Jessica Arredondo just literally vanished.
There are moments in cases where something comes to light and it just strikes you as like a lightning bolt. That happens to Archer. And he wonders, could this be the same guy? The search continues for Rhonda Maloney without success. But Archer believes he's dealing with someone who's a repeat offender. He then reaches out to the Larimer County Sheriff's Department and asks to speak to the detective who worked the Jessica Arredondo case in 1988, and he's put in touch with Detective Toppenberg.
I didn't know Toppenberg, but I hear a lot of really, really, really good things about John.
I'm John Toppenberg, retired deputy with the Larimer County Sheriff's Department. I retired as a detective working major crimes.
Detective Archer, Toppenberg.
There were obvious similarities between these two cases. This particular case started with people that were going south out of Rocky Mountain National Park.
This is really nice.
Oh, it's beautiful here.
Two tourists are returning from an early morning visit to Rocky Mountain National Park. They spot another overlook next to the highway, turnouts where you can go and take photographs. And then they find something horrible. They observe the naked body of a female lying in the rocks.
Officer, how are you?
Detective John Toppenberg from the Larimer County Sheriff's Department responds to the scene.
From examination of the scene, it was obvious that the body was airborne for a short while and came to rest 26 feet from where she was thrown.
There were tire tracks that indicated a car pulled in to the turnout and threw it over the embankment.
She was without clothes when she was thrown over the edge. It was obvious that she had sustained significant trauma to major portions of her body.
The body shows signs of sexual assault. Her face shows evidence of enormous blunt trauma. She's been kicked, she's been stomped. Her teeth are caved in backwards, still in her mouth.
This was perpetrated with purpose, with emotion.
This is someone who is enjoying what he's doing. He is in a wild rage.
We did not know who the victim was. It became clear that a missing person case in Denver coordinated with the description of the victim.
The girl is Jessica Arredondo, who just turned 21 years of age. She is from a Denver suburb.
We followed up with Joe Arredondo, the victim's father.
I was just so sad that happened. We were hoping for the best, but no, it just was terrible what happened. Jessica was very sly and very beautiful. She was very, very bubbly. She was a head cheerleader, and she was very popular. She got along with everybody.
This is just a young girl starting her life, age 21, has her first job. She works at U.S. West as a telephone operator.
We were really, really proud of Jessica. She's just a perfect daughter. The last time I saw her was on that Friday night, and she had plans to go out with a boyfriend. They were going to go out that night to a nightclub.
And at the last minute, she decided she wasn't feeling well and didn't want to go.
All right, babe.
She said, I'll take you down there to the club, and I can leave you off there, and I'll come back and pick you up. So that's what she did. She took him to the club, and that's it.
She drops him at the bar, says she'll be back in an hour, and she never returns. The father says that the night she disappeared, she was driving a new car she had just purchased.
An 88 Mustang, and she had to have that car. She loved that car so much, she didn't want any scratches or anything to happen to it.
And the next question is obvious. Where is that car? So Toppenberg puts out a bolo to all law enforcement agencies, Denver Metro. Within hours, the Mustang is found.
The vehicle's proximity to the bar was at least a mile away.
So Toppenberg arrives at this car. The hazard lights are flashing. The keys are in the ignition. Now, this is this girl's dream, to own this brand new car. Is she gonna walk away? No.
It would be speculative, but obviously there would have been a kidnapping, violent kidnapping, where she was taken.
Toppenberg looks more closely at the car, and he notices fresh rear-end damage, as if she's been tapped from the rear by someone in a car. What if the driver of that car is the killer, and he is trying to get her to stop? She puts her four-way flashers on and gets out of her car to check the damage of her dream machine.
What the hell, man?
He gets out of his car and grabs her by the throat. And now she's gone and winds up thrown off a cliff on Highway 36.
But as that case progressed, we ran into way too many dead ends.
The Arredondo case goes cold, dormant. Until February 1994.
It looked like it was a case basically like Rhonda. If I didn't know better, I'd say the same person who killed her killed Jessica Arredondo.
Our killer's MO is the use of a fender bender, all for a simple reason. It's successful.
The Arredondo case came into sharp focus the moment the Rhonda Maloney case came into view. And there was no looking back.
Archer and Toppenberg are both convinced this is the same fellow. Using the same technique. This is him. Archer and Toppenberg are investigating two cases. It's the current case of the missing Miss Maloney, who still hasn't been found, and of course the death 6 years earlier of Jessica Arredondo. These are girls from the Denver suburbs. They were hit from the rear by another vehicle.
And I was literally just matching Tottenberg's case to my suspect, who had the exact same MO.
I don't recall having any real question about whether that was perpetrated by the same suspect. It all fit.
This is only the beginning of this case. And there's about to be another murder if we don't find that girl.
At that point, we were still searching for Rhonda, and that Saturn. So I start reaching out to Rhonda's family, because that's where we wanted to start. Where did she come from? Where was she going? Why was she wherever she was when she was abducted?
My name is Carrie Gemeinhart. I am Rhonda Maloney's sister. Rhonda was my best friend. We spent the majority of our time together growing up. She was always with me. We pretty much did everything together. Rhonda was a happy person who was lively and funny and had a great sense of humor and could live life to the fullest. At the time that this happened, it was myself, Rhonda, my brother-in-law, Carrie, and my mom. We all lived in the house together in Broomfield. They told us that they had found Rhonda's car on the side of the highway. You know it's not going to be good at that point. Rick Archer made quite an impression on me. He just seemed very focused.
You have to be understanding and patient while professionally pushing for the answers you need. It was really established early on that Rhonda had been at work.
She works in a casino in one of the mountain towns close to Denver, where gambling is permitted.
Rhonda was a cocktail waitress. She loved it. She made great money. She was really happy out there. She had to work the later shift, 6 till 2 in the morning, because that's when the casinos closed.
You're looking for a sexual predator, and here we have a pretty young woman who works in a casino as a cocktail waitress. Has our man been a customer in that casino?
We just had no idea. It was very important to get into the Central City casinos to review security footage, because as we all know, a lot can happen in a corner where somebody else isn't going to see it. We wanted to know if there was a casual connection with Rhonda and a young black man up there that could have expanded into something like this. Maybe somebody was a little handsy or a little bit too interested.
Archer reviews all of that to see to it that, yes, she was at work that night. Normal hours, no confrontations, no one followed her out the door. She left work when her shift was over and was headed home. So that reveals nothing to him. It's now been 24 hours since Rhonda Maloney was dragged out of the front yard of the Thornton Police Department, and we still have not found her. The search for the car continues, but no result.
So at that point in time, we actually returned to the initial scene where Rhonda's car was. Now, the car was already gone because we'd impounded it.
The crime scene is all you've got. And when you're not getting anywhere, you go back and start over. Look again, see something new. Who knows?
The scene down on I-76, it was dynamic. It was changing, not even daily, it was changing hourly based on traffic flow and weather conditions.
They spent hours canvassing that scene, and a detective walking up towards the abutment, which was some ways away from the car, he saw a black shape that was in the snow.
He heard something in the snow and walked over and found a pager, something that nobody else had seen.
This is 1994. People carried pagers. A little box that hooks on your belt, tied to a telephone number, where someone can transmit information to you.
They were able to turn the pager on and discovered that it had a message on there that says, "This is Belt Harlan, Detective Sergeant, Denver Police Department. If you found this pager, please return it to me at the Denver Police."
What's a Denver PD pager doing here? What if our sexual predator or killer is a cop? Archer is shocked to discover this pager belongs to a Denver Police Department detective. What is it doing at a crime scene of a kidnapping and an attempted murder?
We pretty quickly put together a lot of information on Belt Harlan. Belt Harlan had a challenging career at the Denver Police Department.
He had got angry at someone in the drive-up lane, and he tried to climb through the window of the drive-up place to get at this guy. He was known for having a terrible temper.
If a policeman decides to start committing crimes, he's a dangerous criminal indeed. He knows the game.
We knew he had a troubled past, but the primary thing was that he didn't even come close to matching the description of our suspect.
He was older, up in age, darker skinned, nothing at all like the description that Jackie gave.
Around that same time, my partner, through his computer work at DMV, found a Saturn with the plate number Cha-Ching. This really interested us because we really felt that that was the sound that a one-armed bandit makes at the casinos, is Cha-Ching when it pays out.
He is a gambler. Well, now, Miss Maloney is a waitress in a casino. He does some more checking, and he finds that the owner of that car is Robert Harlan.
Robert was a light-skinned black man with a moon face and young.
We're not looking at a detective here. We're looking at a detective's son.
It was the craziest thing I'd ever seen. Craziest thing.
So he looks up Mr. Robert Harlan. What Archer is amazed by is the length and depth of his criminal record.
Robert Harlan was a bad egg. Robert Harlan had many, many allegations of sexual assault, many, many allegations of sexual harassment in the workplace.
In addition to that, Archer discovers something else. He worked at U.S. West, which is where Arredondo worked. He worked there when she worked there 6 years ago. He is the perfect candidate for who we're looking for.
This is our guy. So at that point in time, in our world, it was called balls to the wall. This was the most dynamic case I have ever seen in my life. Things were unfolding so rapidly. Our focus was trying to find Rhonda. And in a case like this, we always use SWAT.
In the cop world, everything is RFN. Right now. I need a SWAT team. I need 100 policemen. I need a helicopter. Whatever it is you require is going to show up right now.
We knew he was armed. Absolutely knew he wasn't afraid to shoot. So we use explosive entry and flashbangs.
A flashbang detonates, creating this enormous noise which will deafen anybody for a few seconds, and a brilliant flash of light that will blind you. You are completely disoriented, you can't hear, and you can't see, and that's the point.
The SWAT team made a dynamic entry into the grandmother's house, and we found Robert Harlan in his bedroom. We woke him out of a sound sleep. We took him into custody with literally no issues whatsoever.
Here is Robert Harlan. There is no Miss Maloney. Where is she? They've got a canine with them. The canine hits on the car. They can see in the windows, nothing's in the car, but they can't see into the trunk. Archer is concerned he's going to find something horrible in the trunk of this machine. Archer opens the trunk. And it's empty. Where is she and what did he do with her?
We transported Robert back to Thornton Police Department. My sergeant informed me that he had selected 2 other detectives to conduct the interviews with Robert, and that I was supposed to go home to get some rest. I just explained to him that's not ever going to happen.
Okay, before we even get started, Robert, do you have any idea why you might be down here?
I'm not really.
Robert Harlan was wrapped in this blanket and speaking very softly. Of course, Rhonda was missing, and they were still hopeful to some degree that they might find her alive.
So where am I gonna find her?
I don't know where she is. I'm telling you the truth. I don't remember being with her. None of that.
Deny, deny, deny. That's what he does.
Jessica Ariando? Who is she?
She was a co-worker. I don't know anything about that, man.
I was watching the interview, and I was watching Robert just run the entire thing. And after a bit, I just walked to the interview room, opened the door, and said, "You 2 are done. Out."
Archer came in, fresh face and a new sort of approach.
Robert, look at me. Don't play this chick routine with me. Where is she?
First thing, right in the door. I was like, okay, you're not in charge here. I am.
If I find Rhonda and she's dead, I'm gonna come after you with both barrels because you like me. And I don't like to be lied to, okay?
Up to this point, he's been able to play the victim. Well, now you have somebody who's going head-to-head with him.
What I want is I want you to tell me about Rhonda. And I want you to look at her. And I want you to remember how it felt.
Okay, hey, I might have sold some drugs. You might have
Okay.
whatever.
What does he do? He puts himself with the victim. He says for the purpose of selling drugs. We say for the purpose of rape and murder. But he puts himself with her. And that is significant.
So she gets in your car, you get in her car. How's that work, man? She got in my car. She got in your car. Mm-hmm.
I was starting to get to him. And this has been part of my training for all those years, is to continue down that path.
Obviously, there's something that really pissed you off. Something happened out there. And I'd like to know what it was.
The thing is...
And behold, there's a knock at the door because an attorney showed up at our police department. And it put a stop to everything. Everything.
What's that feeling like?
It was horrible. It was absolutely horrible because I knew that he was ready to give me his version of the rape.
So they're left with no confession, a few incriminating things maybe, but ultimately the case stands as it is. But the next day, Archer's in his office and gets a call from the front desk that Robert Harlan's father, Detective Belt Harlan, is there to see him. And he's carrying a cardboard box.
So Belt told us that he received a call from his other son who said that the day before, Robert had come by his place was fully covered in blood, asked if he could take a shower.
He took his shirt off, and he took out a gun.
He left his gun there, borrowed his brother's car, and went, what we assume is looking for his pager.
And that's how that evidence was brought into the case. The gun that shot Rhonda and that had her blood on it, and the clothing that Robert had been wearing that had her blood on it.
It takes an amazing person and a strength of character to be able to turn evidence in and admit that your son's the killer.
Now Archer has hard physical evidence. Robert is bought and paid for this case. But they still don't know what happened to Miss Maloney.
3 days after taking Robert Harlan into custody, I received a call. It was a road out in Adams County called Imboden Road. And a small bridge over a ditch or creek. And underneath the bridge was Rhonda's body.
This girl is naked, savagely beaten and tortured.
Shattered jaw, shattered eye sockets, in addition to a bullet that was fired into her forehead. I was at that business for 28 years, and I've seen some horrendous crime scenes, and this is one of the most horrendous in terms of the injuries done to Rhonda Maloney.
When they found her, I was with my dad, and I saw the look on his face. And all I remember was screaming at him, no, don't say anything, because I knew as soon as I saw him.
Her family was very much, all we want is for him to be convicted, and that's all we need.
Robert Harlan goes on trial for the first-degree murder of Rhonda Maloney and the attempted first-degree murder of Jackie Carrazzo. In the autopsy, the toxicology report came back negative. This totally unravels Harlan's statement about selling this girl drugs. She doesn't use drugs.
We presented evidence that showed that Harlan was a sociopath, that he was a predator, and it was the way of his life.
The idea of surveilling and selecting a victim in advance makes it plausible that Robert Harlan followed Rhonda Maloney's vehicle after she left work at the casino. He caused a minor vehicle accident causing her to stop. She got out of her car to look for damage. He was able to get her into his car, raping her at gunpoint for 2 hours.
Jackie came around the corner. Jackie stops, and then it's a foot race. Robert goes running towards them, trying to stop them. Hence, in the process, lost his pager.
Harlan fired at the car as he pursued it as they tried to escape from him until they crashed in the front yard of the Thornton PD. So he grabbed the victim again and dragged her out of that car back into his. He ended Rhonda's life that night and put her body in a place where he thought no one would ever be able to find.
Obviously, the central piece in this case was Jackie. She was shot in the spine that caused her paralysis, and she testified bravely, incredibly detailed. It's just amazing.
Jury finds him guilty of first-degree murder, of attempted first-degree murder, first-degree sexual assault, and second-degree kidnapping. Mr. Robert Harlan will spend his life behind bars. Robert Harlan never admitted to the murder of Jessica Arredondo. There was never enough evidence found or presented to move anywhere forward with charging him with the homicide.
If it had not been for his attorney, we would have certainly gone and interviewed him. At left me with a feeling of frustration, a feeling of anger.
We think he's involved, but he has never admitted or even said anything about it. We keep on hoping that something will come up and we'll be able to know what really happened.
I think this case was really important. It left me feeling really proud of everything that we had accomplished. Proud and sad because I didn't think Rhonda's family would ever really get over it.
Her birthday, I go up to the cemetery and I'll go sit and talk.
The air in Saskatoon during the late autumn of 1994 did not just carry the bitter frost of an early Canadian winter, it carried a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the kind of cold that seeped deep into the bone, turning the mud of the remote farmlands southwest of the city into rigid, unforgiving stone. On a nondescript afternoon, a local farmer went about his routine chores, his boots crunching against the dying brush and frozen earth. He expected nothing more than the usual harsh elements of the Saskatchewan prairies, perhaps the occasional stray animal or fallen debris from the skeletal poplars that lined the horizon. But as he cleared a patch of dense, overgrown thicket, his gaze fell upon something that shattered the mundane quiet of the rural landscape. Protruding from the shallow, disturbed earth was not a branch, nor a piece of discarded machinery. It was a pale, weathered fragment of human bone. When the local authorities arrived, the initial routine atmosphere of a missing persons investigation quickly evaporated, replaced by an oppressive, clinical tension. Forensic teams meticulously brushed away layers of damp soil, rotting leaves, and stubborn roots. The silence of the woods was broken only by the rhythmic scraping of small trowels and the low, urgent murmurs of investigators documenting the grim scene. They did not find a single grave. Instead, the earth slowly surrendered a horrifying collective secret. One skeletal remain led to another, and then another. The dirt held the shattered remnants of 3 distinct individuals, young women whose lives had been abruptly and violently extinguished, their bodies left to decay in the shadows of a society that had barely noticed they were gone. As the skeletal fragments were placed into dark evidence bags, a chilling realization settled over the investigation team. This was not the work of a single impulsive act of violence, but the calculated dumping ground of a methodical predator who had operated with absolute impunity under the cover of public indifference. Long before the flashlights of the forensic teams illuminated that grim patch of forest, a different kind of darkness had been quietly moving through the neon-lit, desolate streets of Western Canada. To the casual observer, John Martin Crawford was almost entirely invisible, a nondescript figure melting into the background of gritty urban centers. But beneath that mundane exterior lay a deeply fractured psyche, molded by years of early substance abuse, toxic inhalants, and a growing, unhinged hostility toward the world around him. By the time he reached his late teens, his internal chaos had crystallized into a lethal compulsion. In 1981, within the quiet boundaries of Lethbridge, Alberta, this compulsion found its first target in Mary Jane Sirloin, a 35-year-old Indigenous woman. The sheer brutality of that encounter, a vicious combination of physical assault and fatal stab wounds, should have served as a glaring alarm to the justice system. Yet, through a series of legal compromises, the gravity of his actions was minimized into a charge of manslaughter, resulting in a brief 10-year sentence that saw him back on the streets after serving a mere 7 years. The prison gates swung open in 1989, releasing a man whose violent impulses had not been curbed, but rather refined by time and institutional isolation. Saskatoon in 1992 became his new hunting ground, a city divided by socio-economic fractures where vulnerable populations often slipped through the cracks of institutional protection. Crawford understood these societal blind spots perfectly. He spent his nights behind the wheel of his car, navigating the dimly lit avenues of the city's impoverished neighborhoods, his eyes scanning the sidewalks for women who had no choice but to rely on the dangerous charity of strangers or the volatile street economy to survive. He did not look for a challenge, he looked for isolation, targeting young Indigenous women whose disappearances, he correctly gambled, would not trigger immediate outrage or large-scale police mobilizations. Within the span of a single year, his dark vehicle became a mobile trap. First came 16-year-old Shelley Napope, a youth with her entire life ahead of her, torn away from her world in a calculated abduction that involved the dark camaraderie of a former prison associate. Then, in the crisp autumn days of September, the violence accelerated with terrifying velocity. Eva Taysup, 30 years old, was choked to death, her body callously mutilated to prevent identification before being dragged into the brush. Barely 24 hours later, while the dust from Eva's burial had barely settled, 22-year-old Kalinda Waterhen met the exact same fate, her final breaths taken in the cold, claustrophobic interior of Crawford's vehicle. For more than 2 agonizing years, the families of these young women lived in a state of suspended torment, their desperate pleas for answers echoing in an echo chamber of institutional apathy. In the eyes of the system and the mainstream media, these were not daughters, sisters, or mothers whose absence demanded justice. They were simply missing person statistics from a marginalized community, a collective footnote in the daily news. The silence surrounding their disappearances was a loud, societal affirmation to Crawford that he was untouchable. He continued to walk the streets of Saskatoon, a ghost among the living, carrying the heavy secrets of the shallow graves southwest of the city, while the families of Shelley, Eva, and Kalinda endured sleepless nights, praying for a knock on the door that never came. The true horror of the John Martin Crawford story lies not just in the physical violence he inflicted within the confines of his car or the secluded patches of the Saskatchewan woods, but in the devastating realization that his crimes were enabled by a collective blind spot. A systemic indifference that allowed a serial killer to hunt human beings in plain sight without anyone raising the alarm until the earth itself could no longer hold the truth. To fully understand the dark trajectory that led to the tragic discoveries in the Saskatoon brush, one must examine the stark, contrasting environments that formed the backdrop of this tragedy. The story begins in Manitoba, Canada, where John Martin Crawford was born in 1962 into an environment that provided little stability or moral grounding. From his earliest years, Crawford's life was defined by a quiet but accelerating deviation from social norms, marked by an early and severe dependency on toxic substances. Long before he ever laid a hand on another human being, he was destroying his own cognitive and emotional faculties by inhaling industrial glues, dropping LSD, and heavily abusing cannabis. This prolonged substance abuse did not occur in a vacuum. It exacerbated a deeply unstable mental state that went largely unaddressed by the social and medical structures of the time. By the time Crawford reached his late adolescence, his worldview had warped significantly, turning a troubled youth into a deeply volatile and resentful individual who viewed the people around him not as fellow human beings, but as objects onto which he could project his growing internal malice. The physical setting of Western Canada during the late 70s and early 80s played a crucial role in shaping the predator Crawford would become. Towns like Lethbridge, Alberta, where he eventually migrated, were booming yet fractured communities, marked by sharp divisions between the affluent mainstream population and the marginalized indigenous communities who often lived on the physical and economic fringes of urban life. It was within this specific socio-economic landscape that Crawford's violent compulsions finally crossed the line into lethal action. In 1981, at the age of 19, Crawford encountered Mary Jane Sirloin, a 35-year-old Indigenous woman who was navigating the harsh realities of life in Lethbridge. The encounter was not a random burst of passion, but an explosion of deep-seated misogyny and racial contempt. Crawford subjected Sirloin to a vicious assault, beating and violating her before ultimately taking her life with a knife. The crime scene was a horrific testament to his capacity for cruelty, yet the legal aftermath of this first murder exposed a profound flaw in the Canadian justice system of the era. Instead of facing the full weight of a first-degree murder charge, Crawford and his legal representation managed to navigate the cracks of a flawed judicial process. In 1982, the prosecution agreed to a plea bargain, reducing the charge from murder to manslaughter under the pretense that his youth and severe substance abuse mitigated his intent. He was handed a 10-year prison sentence, a punishment that deeply undervalued the life of Mary Jane Sirloin and sent a dangerous signal to the young killer. Within the walls of the correctional facility, Crawford did not find rehabilitation. Instead, he found an environment that hardened his criminal resolve and allowed his dark fantasies to mature undisturbed. Because of standard institutional policies regarding early release and good behavior, he did not even serve the full duration of his already lenient sentence. In 1989, after just 7 years behind bars, the heavy steel doors of the prison opened, and John Martin Crawford walked back into society as a free man, his violent impulses uncurbed and his understanding of how to evade the ultimate consequences of his actions highly refined. Upon his release, Crawford chose Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, as his new home, a city that perfectly mirrored the geographic and social isolation he required to resume his hunting. Saskatoon in the early 1990s was a place of dramatic contrasts, where the picturesque beauty of the South Saskatchewan River and the bustling downtown core stood in sharp opposition to the gritty, neglected neighborhoods of the West Side. In these impoverished districts, systemic poverty, systemic racism, and a lack of social safety nets forced many vulnerable women, particularly young Indigenous women, into highly dangerous situations just to survive day to day. Many relied on hitchhiking or survival sex work, placing their lives in the hands of strangers every single night. Crawford recognized these dynamics immediately and began using his vehicle as a predatory tool, driving through the dimly lit, ice-glazed avenues of Saskatoon's underbelly during the dead of night. The geography of the city, with its quick transitions from urban streets to vast, unmonitored rural gravel roads and dense patches of wild brush, provided the perfect logistical layout for a serial killer to operate, transport, and conceal his crimes without drawing the attention of an indifferent public or an under-resourced police force. To truly understand the depth of the tragedy that unfolded in the dark corners of Saskatchewan, one must look past the clinical police reports and the sterile language of court documents to look directly at the lives that were so brutally stolen. These women were not the anonymous, disposable caricatures often portrayed by a detached public. They were vibrant individuals with complex histories, deep family ties, and futures that were supposed to stretch out long past the year 1992. The youngest among them was Shelley Napope, a 16-year-old girl whose life was still in its formative chapters when she crossed paths with John Martin Crawford. Those who knew Shelley remembered her as a youth possessed of an infectious, resilient energy despite the systemic challenges that surrounded her upbringing. She was a student, a daughter, and a friend, navigating the tumultuous waters of adolescence in an environment that offered very few safety nets for young Indigenous girls. Her laughter was a constant anchor for her family, a brief respite from the generational hardships that weighed heavily on their community. When she walked out of her home for the last time, she left behind unfinished homework, unfulfilled dreams of adulthood, and a family that adored her, her sudden absence leaving a gaping, agonizing void that no passage of time could ever hope to fill. Further along the path of life was Eva Taysup, a 30-year-old woman whose story was one of survival, endurance, and a quiet, persistent dignity. Eva had lived through the sharp edges of societal neglect, yet those who shared her life spoke of a woman who possessed a deep capacity for warmth and a fierce protectiveness over the people she cared about. She was a mother, a sister, and a vital link in her extended family chain that relied on her presence for stability. In the neighborhoods of Saskatoon where she walked, Eva was a recognizable face, someone who understood the harsh realities of the streets but never let those realities entirely extinguish the core of her humanity. Her life was a delicate balancing act, a daily struggle against economic marginalization that forced her into vulnerable spaces where the shadows were always a little longer and the dangers a little more immediate. Her family did not view her through the cold lens of her circumstances. To them, she was an indispensable soul whose voice, advice, and maternal warmth were the foundations of their daily lives, making the sudden, terrifying silence that followed her disappearance a form of psychological torture for those left behind. Then there was Kalinda Waterhen, a 22-year-old woman whose life was characterized by a youthful spirit caught in the grinding gears of a society that refused to see her worth. Kalinda was at an age where the possibilities of the future should have been wide open, a time for self-discovery and building a permanent place in the world. She possessed a quiet determination, a quality that her relatives often noted when describing how she faced the systemic barriers placed in front of young Indigenous women in Western Canada. Her connections to her cultural roots and her family were deep, providing her with a sense of identity that stood strong against the isolating winds of the urban landscape. Like Shelley and Eva, Kalinda's presence in Saskatoon was marked by the necessity of navigating dangerous terrain, but her vulnerability was a product of a failing social system, not a reflection of her character. When her life was violently cut short, the community lost a piece of its future, a young woman who carried the hopes of her ancestors and the love of her contemporary kin, leaving her family to search the empty streets for any sign of her smile. For more than 2 long, grueling years, the families of Shelley, Eva, and Kalinda were trapped in an agonizing limbo that was exacerbated by a profound institutional apathy. When these families walked into police stations to report their loved ones missing, they were not met with the urgent, high-stakes mobilization that usually accompanied the disappearance of affluent citizens. Instead, they were often greeted with dismissive shrugs, bureaucratic delays, and the subtle, toxic implication that these young women had simply drifted away by choice. The systemic racism of the era manifested as a refusal to investigate, a collective turning away by authorities who classified these cases as low-priority missing persons from a marginalized demographic. Mothers, sisters, and aunties took it upon themselves to plaster the streets with photocopied posters, to walk the dangerous alleys at night calling out names into the cold air, and to constantly badger indifferent officials for updates. This prolonged period of neglect forced the families to grieve in a vacuum of information, knowing in their hearts that something terrible had happened, yet forced to endure the daily horror of a world that treated the disappearance of their daughters as just another unremarkable statistic. The year 1992 became a dark timeline of escalating violence in Saskatoon, as John Martin Crawford transformed his vehicle into a rolling chamber of horrors, executing a series of calculated attacks with terrifying precision. The descent began with 16-year-old Shelley Napope, whose youth and vulnerability made her an easy target for a man who had honed his predatory instincts during his previous stint in prison. On the night of her disappearance, Crawford did not act entirely alone in the initial stages. He was accompanied by Bill Corrigan, a former prison associate who shared his dark proclivities and provided a toxic form of camaraderie. They spotted Shelley walking along a dimly lit street, her small frame illuminated briefly by the harsh neon glow of the city's west side. Under the guise of offering a ride or through sheer physical intimidation, Crawford forced the terrified teenager into the back of his car, slamming the door shut on her youth and her future. The vehicle sped away from the safety of the urban center, heading toward the isolated, unmonitored gravel roads that crisscrossed the rural outskirts of Saskatoon. Inside the claustrophobic confines of the moving car, Shelley's initial confusion quickly turned to absolute terror as Crawford's demeanor shifted from a nondescript driver to a ruthless predator, subjecting her to a brutal abduction before ultimately taking her life in a secluded patch of brush, leaving her young body hidden beneath the falling autumn leaves. As the weeks bled into September, Crawford's violent compulsions did not dissipate. Instead, they intensified, driven by the realization that his first crime had triggered no significant police response or public outcry. On a crisp autumn evening, he crossed paths with 30-year-old Eva Taysup, a woman who was simply trying to survive the unforgiving environment of Saskatoon's streets. Crawford pulled his vehicle up to the curb, his eyes cold and calculating behind the steering wheel as he coaxed Eva into the passenger seat. The trap snapped shut the moment the car pulled away from the curb. Crawford drove directly toward the familiar, isolated wooded areas southwest of the city, away from any potential witnesses or passing headlights. When he reached a destination shrouded in absolute darkness, he turned on Eva with explosive, lethal violence. He used his immense physical strength to overpower her, wrapping his hands or a makeshift ligature around her neck, slowly and methodically cutting off her breath while she fought desperately for her life in the cramped interior of the car. After her struggles ceased, Crawford displayed a chilling level of forensic awareness and cruelty. Before dragging her body into a shallow depression in the earth, he used a sharp instrument to sever one of her arms. A deliberate effort to destroy identifiable tattoos or physical markers that might link the corpse back to her missing person report, before covering her remains with dirt and branches. The depth of Crawford's depravity was fully realized just 24 hours later, when the earth over Eva Taysup's grave was still fresh and undisturbed. Instead of retreating into hiding or letting the adrenaline of his previous murder subside, Crawford was out hunting again the very next night, his psychological boundary against killing completely shattered. His third target was 22-year-old Kalinda Waterhen, who was navigating the same perilous late-night avenues of the city. With a chilling repetition of his previous tactics, Crawford lured Kalinda into his vehicle, exploiting her need for transportation or survival in a city that offered her no other protection. The sequence of events that followed mirrored the horror of the night before with devastating exactness. He drove her out to the same desolate rural sector, the car's headlights cutting through the heavy dust of the gravel roads before being switched off to plunge the scene into pitch-black isolation. Inside the dark cabin, Crawford attacked Kalinda without mercy, ignoring her pleas and overpowering her resistance as he sipped the last breaths of life from her body through the exact same method of brutal strangulation. Demonstrating a horrifying rhythm of serial violence that claimed 2 young lives in less than 2 days, cementing his status as one of the most prolific and cold-blooded predators in the region's history. The long, agonizing silence that had blanketed the disappearances of Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Waterhen for over 2 years was finally shattered in October 1994, not by a breakthrough in a police station, but by the mundane rhythm of agricultural life. Southwest of Saskatoon, the vast Saskatchewan prairies give way to patches of dense, wild brush, where poplar trees and thick shrubs create natural barriers against the biting prairie winds. A local farmer was navigating this isolated terrain, clearing brush and preparing his land for the fast-approaching winter, when his routine was abruptly halted. His eyes caught an anomaly in the dirt, something pale and structured that did not belong among the rotting leaves and tangled roots. Leaning in closer, the chill in his spine had nothing to do with the autumn air. It was a fragment of a human skeleton, partially unearthed by the elements and scavengers. The farmer immediately contacted the authorities, setting off a chain reaction that would expose the horrific secret the earth had been keeping. When the forensic excavation teams and homicide investigators arrived at the scene, they realized they were not dealing with a simple historical burial or an isolated incident. The area was quickly cordoned off, turning the quiet patch of woodland into a highly clinical, tense crime scene. Under the grey, overcast sky, specialists dressed in white protective suits knelt in the dirt, using small trowels and soft brushes to systematically peel back the layers of earth, root, and decay. The process was slow and painstaking, punctuated only by the quiet measurements taken by surveyors and the flashes of forensic cameras capturing the grim geometry of the graves. As the dirt was carefully sifted, the site began to yield a devastating amount of evidence. Investigators did not find just one body, they uncovered a communal dumping ground. The earth slowly surrendered the skeletal remains of 3 distinct young women, their bones showing signs of being subjected to the elements and animal activity over a prolonged period. The physical evidence at the scene told a story of extreme violence and a total lack of respect for human dignity. As the forensic pathologists examined the remains in situ, they noted key anatomical anomalies that pointed directly to homicide. In the case of one set of remains, later identified as Eva Taysup, the skeleton was missing a limb, confirming that a deliberate act of dismemberment had occurred post-mortem to hinder identification. Nearby, the remains of Kalinda Waterhen and the young Shelley Napope were carefully exhumed, their positions in the shallow depressions indicating they had been callously dumped and covered with just enough soil and brush to keep them hidden from casual view. The investigators also recovered small fragments of clothing, weathered fabric fibers, and microscopic trace evidence trapped in the soil surrounding the bones. These minute details were meticulously catalogued, labeled, and placed into evidence bags, as the team knew that in a case where the bodies had been reduced to skeletons, these tiny physical threads would be the only way to tie the victims back to their killer. The atmosphere at the recovery site was heavy with a mix of professional focus and profound grimness. For the detectives on the scene, the discovery brought an immediate wave of pressure and a sudden realization of the systemic failure that had allowed this to happen. For over 24 months, these women had been missing, and now, the physical proof of their violent ends was laid bare in the cold Saskatchewan dirt. The forensic team worked late into the nights, using generator-powered floodlights that cast long, dancing shadows against the trees, illuminating a scene that looked like a nightmare. Every handful of dirt sifted, every bone categorized, and every piece of trace evidence collected was a step toward identifying the victims and building a case against an unknown predator. The discovery of the bodies transformed the missing persons files from cold, ignored paperwork into an active, high-priority hunt for a serial killer. sending a shockwave through the local community and forcing the authorities to finally confront the reality that a monster had been operating in their midst. The identification of the skeletal remains as Shelina Pope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Waterhen plunged the Saskatoon Police Department into a high-stakes, pressure cooker investigation, but the initial phase was marked by an agonizing series of dead ends and systemic blindness. Because the bodies had lain in the damp, freezing earth for over 2 years, traditional forensic clues like fingerprints, DNA-rich fluids, and immediate soft tissue trauma had been largely erased by the natural processes of decay and seasonal shifts. Detectives were left with a puzzle consisting of bare bones, weathered clothing fibers, and a vast, unhelpful timeline that stretched back to the middle of 1992. The investigation team began by reconstructing the final known movements of the 3 women, a task that proved monumentally difficult due to the marginalized nature of their lives and the lack of initial documentation when they first disappeared. Investigators combed through gritty street corners, interviewed hotel managers in the city's west side, and questioned local transient individuals who might have seen the victims getting into a vehicle. However, the transient nature of the street economy meant that memories had faded, witnesses had moved away, or individuals were deeply distrustful of the police, leading to a wall of silence and contradictory statements. During these early months, the task force chased numerous dead ends and peripheral suspects, operating under various theories that often led nowhere. One early hypothesis focused on the local transient sex trade network, with detectives investigating whether a traveling truck driver or an out-of-town laborer passing through the Trans-Canada Highway was responsible for the killings. This theory led to weeks of checking fuel station logs, hotel registries, and tracking long-haul shipping routes, but the lack of a specific vehicular description or a digital footprint in 1992 made it impossible to pinpoint a single suspect. Another line of inquiry looked into local gang rivalries and predatory drug dealers operating in the impoverished avenues of Saskatoon, under the assumption that the women might have run afoul of criminal elements. This path resulted in the aggressive interrogation of several known street-level criminals, which yielded plenty of minor narcotics arrests but absolutely zero actionable intelligence regarding the triple homicide. Each lead seemed to dissolve under close scrutiny, leaving the detectives with stacks of folders filled with circumstantial rumors, dead-end tips, and a growing sense of frustration as the public and the victims' families demanded answers. The investigative paralysis was compounded by the fact that John Martin Crawford was practically invisible on the police's immediate radar for these specific crimes, despite his violent criminal history. Because his previous 1981 conviction for the killing of Mary Jane Sirloin had been legally downgraded to manslaughter, he was not classified in the system as an active, high-risk serial predator but rather as a rehabilitated parolee who had completed his time. He lived a quiet, nondescript existence in Saskatoon, maintaining a low profile that allowed him to blend seamlessly into the background of the city. The police database of the era did not feature the interconnected cross-referencing software that would automatically flag a former manslaughter offender living within a 3-mile radius of where 3 missing women were last seen. This technological gap and institutional oversight created a protective shield around Crawford, allowing him to walk past police cruisers and go about his daily routines while the task force remained entirely bogged down in local street gossip and fruitless highway tracking. As weeks turned into months with no arrests, the atmosphere inside the homicide unit grew increasingly tense, defined by a desperate need for a tangible breakthrough. The physical evidence from the gravesite, the severed arm of Eva Taysup, the shallow depth of the burials, the proximity of the bodies, pointed undeniably to a single, local perpetrator who knew the geography of the Saskatoon outskirts intimately. Yet, without a living witness, a vehicle description, or a direct physical link between a suspect and the burial ground, the case was rapidly freezing over. The files sat on the desks of investigators, a heavy reminder of 3 young lives cut short and a monster who was still navigating the cold winter streets of Saskatchewan, completely undetected, waiting for the heat of the discovery to die down so he could potentially find his next target. The wall of investigative frustration finally crumbled in January 1995, when a living voice from the past broke through the silence and provided the definitive break the Saskatoon Police Department desperately needed. A local woman, having heard the widespread and terrifying news reports about the 3 skeletal remains unearthed in the southwest brush, walked into the police station with a harrowing story that had haunted her for over 2 years. In late 1992, around the exact same time Shelley, Eva, and Kalinda had vanished from the city streets, this woman had crossed paths with a nondescript man driving a dark vehicle through the West Side. She had accepted a ride, expecting a routine transit through the urban center, but the journey quickly transformed into a struggle for survival. The driver bypassed her destination, ignored her protests, and steered the vehicle onto the isolated, pitch-black gravel roads leading away from Saskatoon, mirroring the exact predatory pattern that had sealed the fates of the other victims. Once they were deep within the secluded rural brush, the man turned on her with explosive violence, wrapping his hands tightly around her neck in an attempt to choke her to death. Through sheer adrenaline and physical resistance, she managed to fight off her attacker, break free from his grip, and leap from the vehicle into the freezing darkness, running until she reached safety. This survivor did not just bring her trauma to the police, she brought an invaluable, detailed description of her attacker, his behavior, and his vehicle, which allowed detectives to finally narrow their focus. When she described his physical features, his cold, detached demeanor, and the specific interior details of his car, a seasoned investigator within the task force connected the description to a name that had been buried in the local parole registries: John Martin Crawford. The realization hit the homicide unit with immense force. Crawford was not just a random resident, he was a convicted killer who had taken the life of Mary Jane Sirloin in Alberta over a decade prior through methods that heavily relied on physical brutality. Detectives immediately pulled his complete criminal file, recognizing the terrifying parallels between his 1981 manslaughter conviction and the current triple homicide. The behavioral signature, targeting vulnerable Indigenous women, utilizing a vehicle to isolate them, and employing strangulation or severe physical trauma, matched perfectly with the evidence gathered from the shallow graves southwest of the city. With a concrete suspect in their sights, the police did not rush to make an immediate, premature arrest that might fall apart in a court of law. Instead, they initiated a high-intensity, covert surveillance operation to secure airtight physical evidence. Task force units monitored Crawford's daily movements, tracking his car as he drove through Saskatoon, ensuring he could not claim another victim while they built their case. The critical breakthrough came when forensic experts obtained a warrant to seize and analyze Crawford's vehicle, the very car described by the surviving witness and suspected of being the mobile crime scene for the murders of 1992. Forensic scientists treated the interior of the car with extreme care, using specialized vacuum systems, chemical reagents, and high-intensity alternate light sources to search for microscopic traces that had survived Crawford's attempts to clean the vehicle over the preceding 2 years. The microscopic world inside the car yielded the undeniable proof the investigation required. Hidden within the deep crevices of the upholstery, beneath the floor mats, and inside the trunk, forensic technicians recovered minute fabric fibers, hair samples, and microscopic trace elements that matched the weathered clothing remnants found on the skeletal remains of Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Water-Hen. Furthermore, the search uncovered specific material links that tied the vehicle directly to the unique soil and plant composition of the remote burial site. The combination of the surviving victim's identification, Crawford's documented violent history, and the overwhelming forensic matches found within his personal vehicle created an inescapable net. In late January 1995, armed with a comprehensive stack of forensic reports and a definitive arrest warrant, heavily armed tactical units closed in on John Martin Crawford, arresting him without incident and bringing an end to his reign of terror on the streets of Saskatchewan. The atmosphere inside the Saskatoon Court of King's Bench in May 1996 was thick with a palpable, freezing tension as the formal trial of John Martin Crawford finally commenced. The gallery was packed to its absolute capacity, filled with the grieving families of Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Water-Hen, alongside community elders, activists, and journalists who had traveled from across the province to witness a long-delayed reckoning. Crawford sat at the defense table, maintaining the same chilling, stoic demeanor that had defined his existence since his arrest. He appeared entirely detached from the gravity of the proceedings, his eyes scanning the courtroom with a cold, unblinking indifference that sent a shudder through those who locked eyes with him. The prosecution began its presentation by systematically laying out a complex labyrinth of physical and circumstantial evidence, designed to strip away any possibility of doubt. They did not rely on emotional rhetoric alone. Instead, they anchored their arguments in the clinical, undeniable facts provided by forensic science, transforming the courtroom into a grim theater of reality where the earth itself seemed to bear witness against the accused. The prosecution's case reached its emotional and strategic peak when the surviving witness from the 1992 attack took the stand to face her attacker. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as she detailed the terrifying sequence of her abduction, describing how Crawford's mundane exterior vanished the moment his car turned onto the dark, isolated gravel roads outside the city limits. With immense bravery, she recounted the feeling of his hands tightening around her throat, the suffocating loss of air, and the sudden, desperate realization that she was fighting for her life against a man who intended to discard her body in the woods. Her testimony provided the jury with a living, breathing blueprint of Crawford's predatory methodology, bridging the gap between his past crimes and the silent skeletons unearthed in the brush. Following her testimony, forensic experts took the stand, displaying large charts of fiber analysis, hair matches, and soil samples that linked the interior of Crawford's vehicle directly to the unique ecosystem of the remote burial site and the clothing remnants of the 3 deceased victims. The defense attempted to argue that the evidence was purely circumstantial and that the prolonged exposure of the remains to the elements compromised the integrity of the findings, but their arguments withered under the sheer volume and precision of the prosecution's scientific data. After weeks of exhausting, emotionally draining testimony, the jury retreated to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in a state of suspended agony for hours that felt like days. When they returned, the foreman read the verdicts with a steady, resolute voice that cut through the heavy air. John Martin Crawford was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of 16-year-old Shelley Napope, a conviction that reflected the calculated nature of her abduction and the involvement of his associate. For the deaths of Eva Taysup and Kalinda Water-Hen, he was found guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder. The judge, in delivering the final sentence, did not mince words, condemning Crawford's utter lack of humanity and his deliberate targeting of vulnerable members of society. He sentenced Crawford to 3 concurrent terms of life imprisonment, with a strict stipulation that he would not be eligible to apply for full parole for a minimum of 25 years. While the sentence provided a legal conclusion, the families in the gallery did not erupt in celebration. Instead, tears of exhaustion and profound grief flowed quietly down their faces, knowing that while the monster was finally locked away behind maximum security steel bars, the heavy iron doors of justice could never swing open wide enough to return their daughters to their arms. The final echoes of the gavel marking the end of John Martin Crawford's trial did not bring a sudden wave of peace to the city of Saskatoon, nor did it erase the heavy, collective guilt that hung over the entire nation of Canada. Long after Crawford was transported to the maximum security facility to begin serving his 3 life sentences, the true, systemic horror of his crimes continued to unravel in the public consciousness. In December 2020, Crawford quietly passed away behind bars at the age of 58 while serving his time at the Regional Psychiatric Center in Saskatoon, bringing a clinical end to his physical existence. Yet his death offered little solace to a community that had been permanently altered by his predatory reign. The emptiness left in the homes of Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Water-Hen remained as vast and painful as it had been during the 2 years they were missing. For their families, justice was not a magic cure that could heal the profound trauma of their loss. It was simply a cold, official acknowledgement that their daughters had been stolen by a monster who should have never been allowed to walk the streets in the first place. The profound tragedy of the John Martin Crawford case lies not only in the brutal actions of a single serial killer, but in the devastating societal indifference that acted as his ultimate accomplice. For over 2 years, while 3 young Indigenous women lay in shallow, unmarked graves in the remote Saskatchewan brush, their families cried out for help to an institutional system that largely turned a blind eye. The mainstream media did not splash their faces across the front pages, and the authorities did not launch high-profile, urgent task forces to scour the province for their whereabouts. It was this systemic racism and social apathy that created the perfect camouflage for Crawford, allowing him to hunt human beings in plain sight with absolute confidence that nobody would look for his victims. The case exposed a dark reality within the Canadian justice system, that the lives of Indigenous women were treated as disposable, undervalued statistics, a realization that spurred journalist Warren Goulding to immortalize this institutional failure in his seminal book, which challenged the nation to confront its own deep-seated prejudices and the lethal consequences of its indifference. Today, the names of Shelley, Eva, and Kalinda serve as a somber, permanent reminder of a struggle that continues to resonate across North America regarding missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Their stories forced a painful but necessary national conversation, shifting the focus away from the clinical details of a serial killer's psychology and toward the systemic vulnerabilities that allow such predators to thrive. The shallow graves southwest of Saskatoon became a symbol of a broader, historical neglect that demands continuous vigilance, institutional reform, and a profound shift in how society values the lives of its most marginalized citizens. As the wind sweeps across the vast, frozen Saskatchewan prairies, rustling through the poplar trees where the bodies were once hidden, it carries a silent, eternal demand for remembrance. The true legacy of this dark chapter is a collective vow that the voices of the vulnerable will no longer be ignored, that their disappearances will never again be treated as a footnote, and that the memory of these daughters, mothers, and sisters will be preserved with the dignity, respect, and love that our indifferent world denied them while they lived. The overarching narrative of the John Martin Crawford case must ultimately be viewed as a foundational pillar in the modern movement for systemic accountability and structural justice across the Canadian landscape. The deep scars left on the communities of Western Canada did not fade with the closing of court files or the death of the perpetrator. Instead, they transformed into a powerful catalyst for grassroots mobilization and institutional self-reflection. For decades following the 1996 trial, Indigenous elders, family members of the victims, and legal advocates pointed directly to the failures in Saskatoon as undeniable evidence that a complete overhaul was needed in how law enforcement agencies handle cases involving marginalized individuals. The quiet, persistent advocacy born out of this specific grief eventually helped pave the complex, emotionally heavy way for the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. A massive undertaking that sought to systematically dismantle the very apathy that allowed Crawford to operate undetected for years. This institutional shift required a painful re-evaluation of how police databases cross-reference violent offenders and how missing persons reports are prioritized across provincial borders. The historical reality that Crawford was able to secure a lenient manslaughter plea in 1982 after committing a brutally violent homicide against Mary Jane Sirloin remains a textbook example of judicial failure studied by criminologists and legal scholars today. It highlighted a systemic tendency to undervalue the lives of Indigenous victims, a flaw that effectively allowed a budding serial killer to receive what amounted to an institutional training period before being released early to hunt again. Modern judicial reforms have since placed a much higher scrutiny on plea bargains involving extreme violence, ensuring that the predatory patterns of offenders are thoroughly analyzed rather than dismissed as isolated, substance-induced incidents. The lessons learned from the investigative dead ends in 1992 and 1993 have slowly forced police services to build dedicated missing persons task forces that prioritize immediate action and community collaboration over bureaucratic indifference. Beyond the walls of government buildings and police precincts, the true, lasting memorial to Shelley Pope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Waterhen lives on in the collective memory and resilience of their communities. Every year, as the autumn frost begins to settle over the Saskatchewan prairies, vigils and memorial walks are held to ensure that the names of these women are spoken aloud, keeping their humanity at the absolute forefront of the public consciousness. These gatherings are not merely expressions of mourning, they are fierce declarations of presence and value, proving that the bond of family and culture is vastly more enduring than the violence that sought to erase them. By refusing to let these stories slide into the dark corners of historical obscurity, the families have reclaimed the narrative from the true crime sensationalism that often surrounds serial killers. Ensuring that John Martin Crawford is remembered only as a pathetic coward whose crimes were exposed, while his victims are honored as cherished daughters, mothers, and sisters who are deeply loved and profoundly missed. The enduring resonance of this case also forces a deeper examination of the role that independent journalism and community-led documentation play in the pursuit of historical truth. For many years after the final verdicts were handed down, mainstream historical records of Canadian crime continued to give disproportionate weight to perpetrators whose victims came from affluent, urban backgrounds, while the names of Mary Jane Sirloin, Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Waterhen risked being reduced to footnotes in dusty archival boxes. The intervention of alternative media, localized podcasts, and dedicated authors served as a vital corrective to this historical erasure, pulling the details of the 1992 Saskatoon murders out of institutional obscurity and placing them squarely within the context of a continuous, systemic crisis. This shift in storytelling methodology has altered how true crime narratives are consumed by the public, moving the genre away from a morbid fascination with the mechanics of a killer's mind and toward a critical analysis of the societal structures that fail to protect the vulnerable, thereby transforming passive listeners into active advocates for legal and social accountability. Furthermore, the geographic landscape southwest of Saskatoon where the bodies were discovered has itself become a silent, sacred monument to resilience and the unbreakable connection between the people and their ancestral lands. The remote patches of brush and gravel roads, which Crawford once viewed as complicit allies in concealing his depravity, have been reclaimed by community members who visit the area to offer prayers, leave tobacco, and tie ribbons of remembrance to the branches of the poplar trees. This act of reclamation is a profound spiritual rejection of the violence that occurred there, transforming a site of trauma into a space of healing, memory, and cultural strength. It serves as a physical manifestation of a community's refusal to let the land be defined by the actions of a predator, ensuring instead that the earth continues to hold the spirits of the victims with the dignity, warmth, and protection that the surrounding society failed to provide during their final hours on this earth. Ultimately, the comprehensive chronicle of the John Martin Crawford murders leaves an indelible mark on the collective conscience of anyone who confronts its reality, serving as a permanent warning against the dangers of social fragmentation and institutional neglect. The true measure of justice for Shelley, Eva, Kalinda, and Mary Jane is not found within the walls of the correctional facilities where their killer spent his final days, but in the ongoing, daily commitment of individuals and institutions to ensure that no human being is ever deemed invisible or disposable. As long as their stories are told with absolute clarity, uncompromising detail, and profound respect, their legacies will continue to challenge systemic apathy, dismantle deeply ingrained prejudices, and illuminate the path toward a more equitable and compassionate world where every life is fiercely defended and every absence is immediately noticed. The structural shifts within criminological theory following the exposure of Crawford's operations have fundamentally altered how modern analysts categorize the intersections of vulnerability, systemic bias, and predatory behavior. For decades, traditional criminal profiling relied heavily on the assumption that serial killers functioned in a vacuum, driven entirely by internalized psychological fractures or neurochemical anomalies that triggered a compulsion to kill. However, academic reviews of the 1992 Saskatoon murders forced a radical pivot toward a more holistic, socio-criminological framework that examines how external societal decay directly enables a predator's longevity. Experts now recognize that Crawford was not merely an isolated anomaly operating on pure impulse, but a calculated opportunist who actively weaponized the pre-existing socio-economic fractures of Western Canada to build a highly effective shield of invisibility around his crimes. He understood with absolute clarity that the systemic marginalization of Indigenous women created a protective buffer for his activities, allowing him to navigate the physical and legal geography of Saskatchewan without triggering the immediate, high-resource institutional countermeasures that a similar wave of violence against affluent populations would have inevitably produced. This evolution in understanding has directly influenced the development of modern threat assessment matrices utilized by law enforcement agencies and specialized behavior analysis units across North America. Rather than focusing exclusively on the physical markers of a crime scene or the specific psychiatric history of a known suspect, contemporary investigators are trained to evaluate the specific environmental and cultural blind spots that a predator might exploit within a given jurisdiction. This means that a sudden spike in missing persons reports within highly vulnerable, marginalized communities is no longer dismissed as an expected byproduct of a transient lifestyle, but is actively analyzed as a potential indicator of an active, targeted hunting pattern. The tragic oversight that allowed Crawford to remain undetected for over 2 years, despite a documented history of lethal violence against Mary Jane Sirloin, serves as a permanent case study in the catastrophic cost of failing to connect institutional data across disparate socioeconomic landscapes, proving that a failure to value every community equally is equivalent to providing a serial killer with a tactical advantage. The legacy of this dark chapter also continues to shape the ongoing dialogue surrounding the ethical responsibilities of the true crime genre and public media consumption. The historical reality that the deaths of Shelina Pope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Water-Hen were met with a wall of silence from mainstream news outlets during the early 90s has sparked a rigorous, self-correcting movement among contemporary content creators, journalists, and documentarians. There is an increasing demand for narratives that consciously decenter the perpetrator, stripping away the dark mystique that often surrounds serial killers and refocusing the public's attention entirely on the systemic failures that permitted the violence to occur and the profound humanity of the individuals whose lives were taken. This critical shift ensures that the consumption of true crime material serves a higher educational and advocacy-based purpose, transforming a genre once criticized for sensationalism into a powerful platform for demanding legislative accountability, funding for community-led safety initiatives, and a permanent rejection of the institutional apathy that once allowed a monster to walk through the shadows of Saskatoon completely unchecked. In addition to the academic and structural transformations, the profound psychological toll inflicted upon the families of the victims demands a deeper exploration to appreciate the true scale of Crawford's devastation. The trauma of losing a loved one to sudden violence is inherently shattering, but when that loss is compounded by years of official dismissal, the psychological wound undergoes a toxic mutation known as ambiguous loss. For over 24 months, the relatives of Shelina Pope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Water-Hen were suspended in a horrific psychological vacuum where they were forced to balance the desperate, instinctual hope of a survival miracle against the crushing, intuitive certainty that a monster had taken their daughters. This prolonged state of unresolved grief prevents the mind from initiating the natural processes of healing, trapping the family members in a perpetual state of high-alert anxiety that ravages their physical health, destabilizes their domestic environments, and fractures the foundational trust they placed in the societal structures meant to protect them. The sudden, clinical confirmation provided by the farmer's discovery in October 1994 did not alleviate this trauma, it merely converted a torturous uncertainty into a definitive, concrete nightmare, forcing these families to instantly pivot from an agonizing search to a grueling confrontation with the physical evidence of their loved ones' violent ends. The generational ripple effects of this trauma continue to manifest within the affected communities, demonstrating that a serial killer's impact cannot be measured solely by the number of bodies left in the earth. Children who grew up in the shadow of the 1992 murders inherited a world that had been explicitly defined as hostile and indifferent to their survival. The loss of maternal figures like Eva Taysup fractured the domestic support systems of entire extended families, forcing grandmothers, aunties, and older siblings to step into parental roles while simultaneously navigating their own profound grief and economic hardships. This forced acceleration of maturity among the youth, combined with the omnipresent fear that a predator could snatch them from the streets without consequence, created a collective hypervigilance that alters how an entire generation navigates public spaces, builds relationships, and views their own value within the broader Canadian fabric. The psychological scars are passed down not through genetics, but through the heavy, whispered cautions of elders who must teach their children how to survive in a society that has historically demonstrated a lethal capacity for looking the other way. Ultimately, the reclamation of agency by the survivors and the victims' families stands as the most definitive victory over the darkness that Crawford sought to impose on Saskatoon. By transforming their private, suffocating sorrow into a public, unyielding demand for systemic reform, these individuals effectively stripped Crawford of his ability to permanently silence his targets. The uncompromised preservation of their stories serves as an active, daily resistance against the very forces of social fragmentation and racial prejudice that enabled the crimes to occur in the first place. Every time a community advocate stands before a podium to speak the names of Mary Jane Sirloin, Shelina Pope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Water-Hen, they are actively dismantling the anonymity that the predator relied upon. Ensuring that the final chapter of this narrative is written not by the cold-blooded actions of a serial killer or the clinical indifference of an archival file, but by the enduring, unbreakable love of a community that refuses to let its daughters be forgotten. The profound failure of the provincial and federal correctional frameworks during the interim years between Crawford's first homicide and his 1992 killing spree highlights a critical area of institutional liability that requires exhaustive scrutiny. When John Martin Crawford was processed through the Alberta penal system in the early 1980s for the brutal slaying of Mary Jane Sirloin, his diagnostic evaluations and behavioral profiles were catalogued within an insular, paper-based bureaucratic matrix that lacked any capacity for interprovincial intelligence sharing. Correctional officers and institutional psychologists tracking his progress within the federal penitentiary noted a persistent, flat affect and a complete absence of genuine remorse for his initial crime. Yet these alarming psychological markers were routinely obscured by his superficial compliance with basic prison regulations. This lack of behavioral transparency created a dangerous systemic illusion of rehabilitation, allowing a highly dangerous and deeply deceptive predator to achieve low-risk classifications based merely on his adherence to daily institutional schedules rather than any fundamental cognitive restructuring or emotional reform. The logistical mechanism of his statutory release in 1989 further illustrates how a rigid, mathematical application of early release laws can directly compromise public safety when dealing with complex serial offenders. Under the regulations of the era, inmates who demonstrated basic behavioral compliance were automatically granted release after serving 2/3 of their sentence, completely bypassing any rigorous, individualized risk assessment by a specialized parole board that might have recognized Crawford's latent danger. When he was released into the community, he was placed under a standardized, under-resourced supervisory framework that mandated only sporadic, bureaucratic check-ins with a local parole officer who was simultaneously managing an overwhelming caseload of hundreds of disparate offenders. This superficial level of supervision meant that as long as Crawford maintained a steady residence and avoided overt, public conflicts with law enforcement, his internal psychological escalation, his return to heavy substance abuse, and his midnight vehicular excursions through the impoverished neighborhoods of Saskatoon went entirely unnoticed by the very officers tasked with monitoring his integration into society. This systemic oversight created a fatal operational vacuum, effectively granting Crawford a clean legal slate and a license to re-establish his predatory patterns without drawing any immediate suspicion from local police forces. When he transitioned from Alberta to Saskatchewan, the local Saskatoon police departments were completely unaware that a convicted killer with a specific behavioral compulsion targeting vulnerable Indigenous women had settled within their jurisdiction. The absolute lack of geographic tracing and behavioral tracking for released violent offenders meant that when the first reports of missing young women began to filter into the Westside precincts in early 1992, investigators had no structural reason to cross-reference these local disappearances with a historical manslaughter file from an entirely different province. This profound lack of institutional communication ensured that Crawford could operate with a high degree of confidence, knowing that the structural disconnect between provincial jurisdictions and the lack of comprehensive post-release surveillance had rendered him functionally invisible to the police forces charged with maintaining the peace and security of the city. The operational layout of the Saskatoon Westside during the early 1990s provides an essential geographic context for understanding how John Martin Crawford managed to systematically hunt his victims without drawing immediate attention. This specific sector of the city was characterized by a dense concentration of budget motels, standard rental properties, and dark, unlit commercial alleys that stood in stark contrast to the manicured residential suburbs on the other side of the South Saskatchewan River. The physical infrastructure of these neighborhoods was deeply neglected, with cracked sidewalks, broken streetlights that left vast stretches of pavement in absolute darkness, and a noticeable absence of public surveillance systems or community policing initiatives. For a predator like Crawford, who utilized his vehicle as both a primary hunting tool and a mobile crime scene, this structural decay provided an ideal tactical environment, allowing him to pull up to the curb, engage with vulnerable pedestrians, and exit the urban grid within a matter of minutes without ever appearing on a security camera or attracting the scrutiny of passing patrols. The immediate transition from these urban avenues to the vast, unmonitored expanse of rural Saskatchewan magnified this geographic vulnerability tenfold. Within less than a 10-minute drive from the heart of the West Side, the paved city streets dissolved into a sprawling web of gravel grid roads, isolated farming corridors, and dense patches of wild prairie brush that remained entirely pitch black throughout the night. This immediate proximity to isolation meant that Crawford did not need to plan complex, long-distance logistics to conceal his crimes. He could snatch a victim from a populated urban street and have them completely isolated in a desolate, dark forest before anyone even realized they were missing. The vastness of the rural prairie landscape, combined with the lack of regular highway patrols on secondary gravel roads, ensured that his late-night vehicular movements remained entirely anonymous, transforming the natural geography of the province into an unintentional accomplice that swallowed the screams of his victims and hid the evidence of his violence beneath layers of dust and untamed brush. This physical environment, paired with the deep-seated social isolation experienced by the local indigenous population, created a lethal trap that Crawford exploited with absolute calculation. The young women he targeted were not running away from their lives. They were simply trying to navigate an urban landscape that offered them no safe transportation, no affordable housing, and no institutional protection against the predators who patrolled the shadows. When a vehicle pulled up beside them in the freezing midwinter nights of Saskatoon, the choice to get inside was often driven by a desperate need to escape the bitter cold or to secure enough resources to survive another day in an economy that had completely locked them out. Crawford was acutely aware of these desperate dynamics, using his non-threatening, mundane appearance and the warmth of his vehicle to lure Shelley, Eva, and Kalinda into a space where their survival was entirely dependent on his mercy, a mercy that his deeply fractured, violent psyche was completely incapable of providing. The forensic pathology reports generated after the recovery of the bodies provided the ultimate scientific anchor for the prosecution, translating the silent trauma of the skeletal remains into an undeniable sequence of physical evidence that dismantled Crawford's legal defense. When the remains were brought to the laboratory in late 1994, the advanced state of decomposition presented an immense challenge to the medical examiners, who had to work backward from bare bone to reconstruct the final moments of the victims' lives. Through microscopic analysis of the hyoid bones and the delicate structures surrounding the cervical vertebrae, pathologists identified specific, localized fractures and compression marks that are only produced by the application of intense, prolonged external pressure. This definitive finding proved that both Eva Taysup and Kalinda Waterhen had been subjected to manual or ligature strangulation, establishing a consistent, lethal behavioral signature that linked their deaths directly to the same perpetrator. The cold, mechanical precision of these forensic findings contrasted sharply with the chaotic violence of the crimes, giving the jury a clear, unfiltered view of the absolute ruthlessness required to commit such acts. The post-mortem examination of Eva Taysup's remains yielded an even more chilling revelation regarding the calculated, forensically aware mind of the killer. The absence of her right arm was not the result of animal scavenging or natural environmental erosion, as the defense would later attempt to argue. Instead, the clean, deliberate nature of the bone separation indicated that a sharp, heavy tool had been used immediately after her death to amputate the limb. Pathologists concluded that Crawford had performed this horrific mutilation in a desperate, methodical attempt to prevent future identification. Knowing that Eva carried distinct physical markings or tattoos on that specific part of her body that could easily tie her back to active missing persons databases. This level of post-mortem manipulation shattered the defense's narrative that the killer had acted in a sudden, drug-induced frenzy or a state of diminished capacity. It demonstrated to the court that even after taking a human life, Crawford remained entirely lucid, calculating, and focused on self-preservation, treating the body of his victim as a piece of incriminating evidence that needed to be systematically altered before being dumped in the brush. For the family of Shelley Pope, the forensic data provided a heartbreaking validation of the terror their 16-year-old daughter had endured before her life was stolen. Because her case involved a first-degree murder charge tied to a premeditated abduction, the prosecution utilized advanced soil and fiber evidence recovered from her skeletal remains to prove that she had been transported inside Crawford's vehicle against her will. The analysis of microscopic synthetic fibers trapped in the fabric of her clothing showed an exact chemical and structural match to the interior carpet lining of Crawford's car, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that she had been confined within that rolling trap. The meticulous gathering of these tiny, invisible threads of evidence transformed the courtroom into a space where Crawford's attempts to clean his vehicle over the preceding 2 years were rendered completely useless. The science held him accountable where human eyes had failed, ensuring that the heavy weight of his actions was laid bare for the world to see, and providing a definitive legal foundation that would keep him locked away for the remainder of his natural life. The psychological evaluation of John Martin Crawford during his pre-trial detention and subsequent imprisonment offers a disturbing glimpse into the mind of an organized, opportunistic serial predator who lacked the standard emotional architecture that governs human empathy. Psychiatric experts who interviewed Crawford noted a profound, deeply ingrained narcissistic personality disorder coupled with severe antisocial traits, a combination that allowed him to compartmentalize his violent impulses completely from his everyday mundane existence. When questioned about the murders of Mary Jane Sirloin, Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Waterhen, Crawford demonstrated what psychologists term a flat effect, showing absolutely no physiological signs of distress, guilt, or remorse. Instead, he discussed the events with a cold, detached indifference, treating the lives he had extinguished as insignificant encounters that had merely disrupted his routine. This complete absence of an emotional conscience was not a sudden development. It was the culmination of a life spent indulging in violent fantasies that had been fueled by early substance abuse and reinforced by a judicial system that had consistently failed to hold him fully accountable for his initial acts of brutality. Criminologists who have analyzed the case emphasize that Crawford's psychological stability was heavily dependent on his perception of control, a trait that directly dictated his choice of victims and his method of execution. Unlike disorganized killers who strike randomly during a psychotic break, Crawford was highly meticulous, choosing targets who occupied the absolute margins of society because he calculated that their sudden absence would not trigger a massive institutional response. This predatory calculation is a hallmark of a malignant sociopathy. He did not just seek physical gratification through violence, but actively derived a sense of supreme power from the knowledge that he could operate within the blind spots of an indifferent culture. The act of strangulation itself, which was his preferred method of killing, is recognized by behavioral analysts as the ultimate expression of physical domination, requiring sustained, close-range exertion that forces the killer to confront the dying moments of the victim over several minutes. For Crawford, this intense, horrifying process was the ultimate realization of his need for absolute control, a dark psychological need that he pursued with an icy, unwavering focus until the prison doors finally closed on him for good. The complete failure of any rehabilitation efforts during his time in the federal penitentiary in the 1980s further underscores the incurable nature of Crawford's psychological pathology. Traditional correctional programs designed to foster empathy, manage anger, and address substance dependency were completely ineffective because Crawford possessed a highly developed capacity for superficial compliance and manipulation. He learned to say what institutional counselors wanted to hear, mimicking the vocabulary of reform and using his quiet, non-threatening demeanor to pass basic behavioral evaluations without ever undergoing any genuine internal restructuring. This deceptive camouflage allowed him to mask the volatile, deeply rooted misogyny and racial contempt that continued to fester beneath his calm exterior, ensuring that when he was finally released, he was a more refined, more dangerous predator than when he entered. His psychological profile stands as a stark, permanent warning to the correctional system, proving that basic behavioral compliance inside a controlled environment is never an accurate metric for measuring the latent danger a serial predator poses to the outside world. The role of Bill Corrigan, Crawford's former prison associate who was directly implicated in the initial stages of the abduction of 16-year-old Shelley Napope, introduces a dark, conspiratorial element to the case that further exposes the rot within the criminal underbelly of Saskatchewan. Corrigan was a man who shared Crawford's sociopathic tendencies, having met him within the volatile environment of the federal penitentiary system where both men had been serving time for prior violent offenses. When they were released back into society around the same period, their shared history did not result in mutual support toward rehabilitation. Instead, it created a toxic synergy, a dangerous criminal alliance where each man validated and escalated the dark impulses of the other. On the night Shelley was snatched from the streets of Saskatoon, Corrigan's presence inside the vehicle provided Crawford with an added layer of physical intimidation and psychological confidence, turning a solitary predator into a coordinated hunting pack that left the young victim with absolutely no chance of escape or survival. The dynamics of this criminal partnership during the commission of the crime reveal a chilling level of shared depravity that shocked even the veteran investigators of the Homicide Unit. According to the subsequent investigative findings and legal testimonies, Corrigan did not simply sit passively in the passenger seat, he actively assisted in maintaining physical control over the terrified teenager as the car sped away from the safety of the urban grid into the desolate, unlit rural corridors southwest of the city. This shared participation in an act of extreme violence demonstrates how prison systems, when failing to provide genuine rehabilitation, can accidentally foster deadly networks, connecting violent individuals who combine their skills and malice to target the most vulnerable sectors of the population. Although Crawford was ultimately identified as the primary executioner who took Shelley's life in that secluded patch of woods, Corrigan's willingness to act as an accomplice, an eyewitness, and a supportive partner in the abduction highlighted a terrifying reality: that the shadows of Saskatoon held not just a single monster, but an entire subculture of violent indifference that viewed marginalized young women as prey. The legal handling of Corrigan following the breakthrough in 1995 became a source of significant controversy and intense debate among legal scholars and the victims' families, raising difficult questions about the compromises made in the pursuit of justice. In order to secure an airtight first-degree murder conviction against Crawford, a charge that required definitive proof of premeditation and unlawful confinement, the prosecution had to navigate a complex legal landscape where Corrigan's direct testimony was a crucial piece of the puzzle. The utilization of an accomplice's testimony always carries immense risk, forcing the justice system to strike a delicate balance between punishing all guilty parties and ensuring that the primary, most dangerous predator is taken off the streets forever. While this legal maneuvering was necessary to ensure that Crawford received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of early parole, it left many in the community with a lingering sense of bitterness, serving as yet another reminder of the compromises, gaps, and systemic imperfections that define the long, exhausting road to achieving accountability for the lives of Indigenous women. The historical impact of the book Just Another Indian, A Serial Killer and Canada's Indifference by journalist Warren Goulding cannot be overstated when assessing the legacy of the John Martin Crawford case. Published in the years following the trial, Goulding's work served as a blistering indictment of both the Canadian mainstream media and the justice system, exposing how racial prejudices and socio-economic biases dictated whose lives were deemed worthy of public grief and rigorous investigation. The title itself captured the cold, unwritten sentiment that permeated the institutions of the era, a toxic assumption that the disappearance of an Indigenous woman was an unremarkable, almost expected consequence of her background rather than a horrific tragedy demanding immediate mobilization. Goulding painstakingly documented the stark contrast between the minimal, back-page coverage afforded to Crawford's victims and the massive, sensationalized media storms that accompanied missing persons cases involving affluent, non-Indigenous individuals during the exact same period, forcing a mirror up to a society that had quietly consented to Crawford's hunting ground through its own profound silence. This literary intervention marked a turning point in public discourse, transforming what had been treated as a localized true crime story into a national symbol of systemic racism and institutional neglect. By shifting the lens of inquiry away from the macabre details of Crawford's pathology and focusing squarely on the societal structures that failed Mary Jane Sirloin, Shelley Pope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Waterhen, Goulding's analysis provided a critical framework that grassroots organizations and Indigenous advocates would use for decades to demand accountability. The book became required reading in criminological, legal, and sociological programs across North America, fundamentally altering how future generations of journalists and legal professionals were trained to approach crimes against marginalized communities. It helped dismantle the comfortable illusion that Canada was a universally safe, egalitarian society, exposing instead the deep, unhealed fractures that left specific populations entirely exposed to predators who understood how to exploit the state's indifference for their own lethal gain. Ultimately, the enduring influence of this documentation underscores the reality that true justice involves more than just a guilty verdict inside a courtroom. It requires a permanent commitment to historical truth and structural reform. The work initiated by Goulding and carried forward by the families of the victims laid the essential groundwork for future human rights campaigns, provincial task forces, and national inquiries that continue to fight against the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. By ensuring that the names and stories of these 4 women were permanently etched into the national consciousness, this collective resistance stripped away the anonymity that Crawford had relied upon, transforming a dark chapter of unchecked violence into an unyielding, ongoing demand for systemic change, equality before the law, and a future where no human being's absence is ever treated as just another disposable statistic. The ultimate conclusion of this dark chapter in Canadian history must not be framed as a definitive victory for the justice system, but rather as an ongoing, solemn obligation for continuous societal transformation. The physical death of John Martin Crawford in his prison cell in December 2020 did not bring an end to the structural vulnerabilities he so ruthlessly exploited, nor did it magically heal the profound, generational trauma carried by the communities of Saskatchewan. True accountability for the lives of Mary Jane Sirloin, Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Waterhen requires more than just the historical preservation of their tragic ends. It demands a radical, everyday commitment to dismantling the lingering apathy, socio-economic disparities, and institutional biases that allow contemporary predators to continue targeting marginalized individuals. The legacy of these 4 women must live on not as a collection of clinical forensic data or a case study in true crime literature, but as an unyielding, permanent beacon for human rights, legal equality, and a future where every single individual is valued, protected, and fiercely mourned by the society in which they live. Looking back at the entire trajectory of the John Martin Crawford case, from the first ignored disappearances to the final systemic overhauls, the ultimate lesson is that public safety cannot exist without social equity. When a justice system allows a geographic or cultural blind spot to persist within its borders, it creates a hospitable environment for predatory violence that will inevitably expand until it is forcefully confronted. The modern tracking mechanisms, the specialized missing persons units, and the strict guidelines surrounding violent offenders that exist today are not gifts of institutional benevolence. They are hard-won concessions paid for with the lives of 4 innocent women who were left to face a monster alone in the dark. As the legal frameworks continue to evolve and society slowly learns to listen to the voices it once silenced, the memory of Mary Jane, Shelley, Eva, and Kalinda remains an absolute, non-negotiable standard for progress, serving as a permanent reminder that the true measure of any civilization lies in its willingness to defend its most vulnerable members with the same urgency, resources, and respect afforded to all others. The final integration of these historical lessons into the broader cultural fabric of the nation requires a profound shift in how educational institutions and community spaces preserve the memory of systemic crises. It is no longer sufficient to leave these narratives restricted to the specialized domains of legal archives, police academy curricula, or academic textbooks. Instead, the stories of survival, community resilience, and institutional failure must be woven directly into the public consciousness through memorial initiatives, community art installations, and localized human rights forums. This active process of cultural preservation ensures that the names of Mary Jane Sirloin, Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Waterhen are not merely recalled during specific anniversaries or political campaigns, but remain an omnipresent part of the civic identity of Western Canada. By transforming public spaces into venues for permanent remembrance, society creates a physical and psychological barrier against the recurrence of the apathy that once allowed a serial predator to operate unchecked, making a collective, daily statement that the invisibility Crawford relied upon has been permanently erased. Furthermore, this continuous remembrance serves as an essential tool for empowering future generations of advocates, legal professionals, and grassroots community leaders who will inherit the responsibility of maintaining these structural reforms. When young people learn about the 1992 Saskatoon murders not as an isolated incident of individual depravity, but as a critical turning point in the fight for systemic equity, they gain a deeper understanding of how institutional negligence can have lethal consequences. This educational foundation fosters a critical vigilance, training future generations to recognize early signs of social fragmentation, to challenge biased media representations, and to demand immediate, high-resource accountability whenever a member of a marginalized group goes missing. The ongoing struggle for justice thus transitions from a reactionary response to past tragedies into a proactive, preventative movement dedicated to creating an environment where the economic, social, and physical vulnerabilities that Crawford weaponized are systematically eradicated through sustained social investment and unconditional community care. Ultimately, the true closure of this narrative is an unachievable concept, as no amount of judicial reform, literary documentation, or political apology can ever restore the stolen futures of the victims or fully erase the grief of their descendants. Instead of seeking a comfortable, finalized conclusion that allows society to look away once more, the legacy of this case must remain an open, active wound that continuously goads the collective conscience of the nation toward greater empathy and action. The memory of these women must serve as an eternal, non-negotiable demand for a world where safety is not a privilege dictated by race or socioeconomic status, but a fundamental, guaranteed right for every human being. As long as the community continues to stand together, speaking their names into the prairie wind and fighting for the dignity of the vulnerable, the darkness that Crawford sought to establish will be completely overwhelmed by the enduring light of love, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to absolute equality before the law. The long-term trajectory of this collective vigilance also requires an honest assessment of how modern digital landscapes and global networking have redefined the fight for accountability in cases of systemic violence. In the decades that followed the trial of John Martin Crawford, the advent of social media and decentralized digital platforms provided marginalized communities with unprecedented tools to bypass traditional media gatekeepers, ensuring that future disappearances could no longer be quietly buried in the back pages of local newspapers. Today, when a vulnerable individual goes missing on the prairies of Western Canada, grassroots networks can instantly mobilize thousands of citizens, coordinate independent search efforts, and exert direct, public pressure on law enforcement agencies within a matter of hours. This democratization of information has effectively stripped away the geographical and institutional isolation that Crawford so carefully weaponized in the early 90s, establishing a digital network of community protection that acts as a continuous, omnipresent deterrent against those who still harbor predatory illusions of invisibility. Moreover, the internationalization of this struggle has connected the legacy of Saskatoon to global movements against gender-based violence, systemic discrimination, and state indifference, elevating the stories of these four women into a cross-border symbols of human rights advocacy. Human rights tribunals and international observers now look to the historical failures and subsequent reforms within the Canadian justice system as a critical case study in how institutional bias can inadvertently create a permissive environment for serial predators. This global lens ensures that local authorities are held to international standards of investigative rigor and social equity, reinforcing the reality that the safety of marginalized populations is not a domestic policy debate but a fundamental indicator of a nation's commitment to basic human dignity. The dialogue born from this dark chapter continues to inspire similar advocacy movements across North America and beyond, proving that the resilience of a grieving community can echo far past its original borders to challenge the structures of apathy on a global scale. In the final analysis, the true measure of the progress made since those dark winters of 1992 and 1993 is found not in the perfection of the systems, but in the unyielding determination of the people to hold those systems accountable. The journey from the silent, unmarked graves southwest of Saskatoon to the halls of national inquiries and international forums has been a grueling, painful march driven entirely by the love, dignity, and courage of the victims' families and their allies. By refusing to let the memory of Mary Jane Sirloin, Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Waterhen be defined by the violence that claimed them, they have successfully rewritten the conclusion of this tragedy. They have transformed a narrative of cold-blooded predation and institutional neglect into a permanent testament to community strength, ensuring that the light of truth, equality, and remembrance will forever expose the shadows and protect the generations yet to come. The institutional memory of this case has also forced a fundamental reconfiguration of the relationship between Indigenous legal traditions and the Euro-Canadian judicial framework, creating a vital space for restorative justice and systemic healing that was entirely absent during the original proceedings. In the immediate aftermath of the 1996 trial, legal scholars and tribal leaders increasingly pointed out that the cold, adversarial nature of the conventional courtroom offered no mechanism for addressing the collective spiritual injury inflicted upon the entire community by Crawford's predatory actions. This realization catalyzed a broader movement toward integrating traditional elder-led circles, community-based advocacy groups, and customary healing practices into the post-trial support systems for victims' families, effectively challenging the state's monopoly on the definition of justice. By allowing Indigenous communities to assert their own legal and spiritual autonomy in the wake of such profound trauma, these initiatives have begun to repair the deep-seated institutional distrust that originally allowed Crawford to operate undetected, transforming the ongoing response into an active exercise in self-determination and cultural restoration. Furthermore, the evolving nature of public monuments and naming conventions across the urban landscape of Saskatchewan reflects a growing societal awareness of the need to visually disrupt the historical erasure of marginalized women. In recent years, urban planners, community organizers, and municipal governments have faced mounting pressure to rename public infrastructure, parks, and city streets that historically honored colonial figures, replacing them with symbols that celebrate the lives, cultures, and enduring resilience of the Indigenous people who have always inhabited the land. When a public space is formally rededicated to the memory of those who were lost or to the collective strength of the community that fought for them, it serves as a permanent, physical barrier against the return of the social blindness that Crawford exploited. These visible, permanent changes to the geography of the city ensure that everyday citizens are continuously reminded of the heavy cost of past indifference, forcing an ongoing public conversation about safety, equity, and the collective responsibility to ensure that the west side of Saskatoon, and indeed the entire province, never again becomes a silent hunting ground. Looking to the future, the ultimate safeguard against the recurrence of such horrors lies in the continuous, rigorous monitoring of the very institutional reforms that were enacted in the wake of this tragedy. The creation of specialized task forces, cross-provincial databases, and community policing initiatives is only effective if these systems are consistently funded, critically evaluated, and kept completely free from the subtle systemic biases that originally crippled law enforcement in the early 90s. Grassroots organizations and independent oversight bodies must remain relentlessly vigilant, holding municipal, provincial, and federal authorities to the absolute highest standards of transparency and accountability whenever a missing person report is filed. The true honor owed to Mary Jane Sirloin, Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Waterhen is not found in static declarations of progress, but in this tireless, unyielding daily labor to build a society where the inherent dignity of every human being is recognized as an absolute, non-negotiable truth, ensuring that the dark shadows of the past are permanently driven out by the brilliant, unwavering light of collective care and equal justice. As the narrative of this dark historical chapter reaches its absolute horizon, the focus must shift entirely from the technical and structural postmortems toward a permanent, unshakable contemplation of the human spirits that were stolen. The true conclusion of this chronicle does not belong to the police files, the courtroom transcripts, or the academic treatises that parsed the anatomy of a failure. It belongs solely to the enduring presence of Mary Jane Sirloin, Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Kalinda Waterhen within the living memory of those who loved them. The ultimate legacy of the long struggle against the horrors of Saskatoon is the realization that the armor against darkness is not found in the rigidity of institutional bureaucracy, but in the radical, unyielding enforcement of human value across every line of race, gender, and socio-economic status. By refusing to let these four souls be reduced to a collection of cautionary footnotes, the community has erected an invisible, eternal monument of resistance that stands defiant against the wind of the Canadian prairies. Serving as a permanent declaration that every life is an irreplaceable universe, that no child of the earth is ever disposable, and that the light of truth will forever protect the vulnerable from the shadows of indifference.